Hello, today I am taking a look at Fated Seas for the MyRPG, or rather r/MyRPG free RPG book club, where we look at a free RPG that's voted for every couple of weeks by Jason Huck. Alright, here we've got all the credits. You'll notice that it looks like a lot of the artwork here was used with permission, which means presumably it's not by commission, but if you can get arrangements like that, it's a pretty good way to do things without, paying an artist, which you probably don't have the money for, as a very indie ttrpg maker, or using AI, which is obviously a big no-no for a lot of people. Here we've got the table of contents. Looks like there is some form of linking with it, but I don't know that that fully worked. I clicked on character creation and I go to here, which does not look like character creation fully, or the start of character creation rather. So that's something worth noting. But the arrangement seems to make sense, using the book, how to play, keywords, character sheet, setting. That all seems like a decent order. And then there's a bunch of stuff. Like the other categories all seem to make sense too. A lot of stuff on character creation, which is fairly typical. And then equipment, combat. Equipment presumably being before combat because you use the equipment in combat. But there's a lot of stuff on here also that is not available on the free portion, which is probably smart. It combines elements of traditional role-playing games with the easy-to-learn mechanics of tabletop card games, which not entirely sure I agree with, but I don't know enough tabletop and card games to say what the aggregate is. Like using a basic comparison of D&D versus Magic, I might say Magic is a bit harder to learn, but that's not necessarily emblematic of the entire space for both TTRPGs and tabletop card games. Yeah, so you make your character and then you get a deck of cards. I'm not sure if you build that deck through the choices you make in character creation, or that's a separate process yet, but you have a custom deck of cards representing attacks and defensive abilities. And there's a progression system that lets you add cards, which is cool. It looks like destiny is going to be a major theme and or mechanic, which may lend itself well to some sort of group storytelling elements greater than is present in the standard tabletop, which is more or less, entirely up to the DM and the result of the choices you make, rather than you as a player character or player writing much of the story. But this system may allow more opportunities for that. We'll have to see. Okay, so chapter 1 is the basics and settings. Chapter 2 is character creation. And here, like, based on this, since the deck was tied to character creation, it looks like he's not specifically listing here where the deck rules first come up, or the deck building rules first come up, and I think that's probably a mistake to not have that mentioned explicitly. Yeah, equipment, combat. Okay, non-combat mechanics. It seems like more setting stuff there. Even more setting stuff, it looks like. One specific city. And bestiary stuff, that's nice. It's a tabletop role-playing game. Okay, there is dice, despite it being card-based as well, which may be a little overly complex, but yeah, I was going to say, if you're doing solely card-based, things tend to go in a more deterministic direction, in other words, less chance-based. But if you are just drawing cards at random for certain things, then you could definitely have it still be, non-deterministic card-based. And if you're using cards anyway, there's a potential argument to be made that there should be no dice involved, just for the sake of simplicity. Have explaining dice types. Okay, D12s. Okay, more basic explanations there. So it looks like almost every time you play a card, you also have to roll dice. Again, I think that might end up being overcomplicating things, especially if the point of the cards is to, make it easier to learn. That certainly, I know like a lot of people have spell cards to help them remember spells in D&D, and that in some ways makes learning it easier. But that's not basing an entire system around interactions between cards and dice. So we'll have to see how this plays out. Okay. So this is like the first step is rolling the dice, but it's not really saying what is precipitating the first step. I guess any of these triggers mentioned here. Okay, so as bonuses and penalties as well as modifiers. Yeah, this is definitely sounding relatively complicated. Because, you've got the card, the dice, the modifier, and then potential bonus and penalties from the card, or maybe even passive cards added as well. And compare the result to the target number, but no mention of who's doing this. Whether the DM sets the number, well, I mean, obviously, based on how this description was described so far, the DM probably sets the number. It's more an issue of compare the result to the target number, but if the player doesn't know the target number, then it would be the DM making the comparison. So who exactly, who the burden of this math is on at what stage is not specified at this point. Yep, high number is success, sure, and equals or succeeds, which I believe is fairly typical. Okay, now here it's a little more specific. They set the target number, and they tell them whether they succeed or fail, but it does not specify whether the GM typically tells them whether tells them what the difficulty value is. So the one doing the comparison would ultimately be the GM, likely. Okay. Alright, some details there. Let me check what this link does for a minute, see if anything goes horribly wrong with that. Okay, source books, buy the card bundles, print and play. Yeah, so it looks like you can access the cards without paying for them, which I believe is intentional. Or at least some of the cards. Alright, anatomy of a card. Should we really be getting there at this point? Maybe, who knows. Let me just check that it, agrees with the table of contents. How to play class deck. Because card effect keywords is down to 7, but we're already on anatomy of a card. I guess that's under class deck. And it's labeled as dice, rolls, and checks being after class deck, and yet it looks like we already got to dice, rolls, and checks before class deck, so there might be a little bit of inefficiency in the table of contents there. Alright, if successfully played against an adjacent target, you have to pass a check for that, but it doesn't look like it's dependent on a target armor class or anything like that. Okay, interesting. Sort of sets up opportunity of attacks. Attack of opportunities. Okay. Here it says, alternatively, this card is worth 1 energy. I don't know if alternatively is the right word there. If the player decides to use it to boost the effect of another card, they just play this turn. So you can sort of spend cards like resources as well as actually playing them. That's interesting. This kind of feels like a relatively big info dump early on. And this is like 2 full sentences just for one, point on the card. Yeah, so it's a name and a type, not really a mention of why the type is relevant, but mention of the keywords, why, the keywords are relevant. But do the keywords only appear at A, or is A just one of the places kinds of keywords appear? It's not clear at this point. Yeah, and this, I feel like if you're not going to fully list things and what each keyword is, then this is more information than is necessary. Okay, so the card shows the target number, but earlier it talked about the GM setting that. Let me go back. The GM usually determines target numbers. That seems odd if it tells you what the target number is, and then we'll see if it mentions the GM modifying that in any way. Yeah, so this tells you what the modifier is. Like, I would not say attribute modifier, I'd use attribute or modifier to be consistent in terms of terms. Having both just sort of makes things more confusing. Okay, not all cards require a roll. Not surprising, but I wasn't sure whether that would be the case. Right, attack type and range. Okay, so it's either melee or ranged. And it, tells you the number, but you would think you could simplifying it by having certain numbers, automatically mean the move is melee, and other ones automatically meaning its range. But I suppose having a full icon is helpful. It just kind of makes the description more complicated. Card effect is fairly self-explanatory. I think it would be nice if the descriptions of other things were more like this. This feels very easy to understand. These feel kind of term heavy and dense. Okay, and that's the spending it as a resource thing. You can only use one card for energy per action. Good to know. Right. And under card types, it says your character starts their turn with their full amount of action points. I don't really like that. I just feel like the line immediately following card types should be something that really tells me a lot about card types, not action points. Yeah, like, I don't know what action points really has to do with card types here, because it doesn't look like the card type directly modifies the action point, so I don't know why that's listed here at this point. Yep, and I feel like we've already seen this a couple of different times, but if you pass the check, the thing happens. Okay, buff or heal and discarded. Okay, persistent cards, which may end up being stuff that, modifies rolls as well as the actual card played in a specific case, because they are persistent. Okay. All power cards are persistent, but there are other non-power cards that are persistent. Sure. Right. Power cards are a specific type of persistent card, basically, even though it's not a subheading here for whatever reason. Can only have one power at a time. Reaction cards will probably need more explanation later. That's really weird. Like, I don't know that I would... That sounds like it's a quick rule kind of card that just lists some of the rules on it or something. I would not have that even listed as a type here, because it's so irrelevant. But maybe I'll be wrong. Okay, and there are even more types of cards that are specific. This is a lot of type of cards, probably more than there needs to be. Like, again, I wouldn't be harping so much on complexity and stuff if the game didn't sort of insist that part of the way it was designed was for ease of learning, which, Okay, so that's what the spending cards as resources are for. You can boost cards that specifically have a keyword that says you can. But where would this keyword be located? I'm going to assume for now, since earlier it said, keywords would be in the... Where is it? Card name and card type. Yeah, keywords would be there. that if there was a possibility of energizing, it would be somewhere in there. Let me see if I can check that easily real quick now, because I'd have to go all the way back to the link. Do I want to do that? Yeah, may as well while it's fresh in my head. Click here. Let me try and find something that says energize. Yeah, it does look like the keywords all tend to be, right under the title. So I'm going to have to assume the energize would be there as well for things that energize. But so far, I'm not seeing a ton of them, which you would think when every card has a value, it can be used to spend as a resource for energizing, that there would be a decent number of, cards that actually applies to, that you actually can energize. But so far, I am not seeing a ton. Yeah, that's 2 full character classes at least at base, and none of them appeared to have the energize keyword. Yeah, going back down here. Energy, exceptions to the rule. Okay, 1 card spent per action. Okay, you lose unused energy, no mana burn or anything. Does not persist from round to round. I feel like having both of those there is redundant. Presumably, either a turn is made up of rounds or a round is made up of turns, and then you only need to list the shorter span. I feel like you should really just say discard here, and maybe there's going to be a separate thing that is discarding, but... Okay, yeah, it says it has to be separate from discard. I don't know. That's another thing that's definitely going to be adding complexity down the line. Okay, yeah, specific overrules general, classic. Always round down. Okay, we're like on to play area. I feel like that's way too specific for this early in the rules, but I'll go through it. Yeah, are played on your character's turn as various actions. I prefer can be played, I think, but maybe that doesn't matter. Okay, so you can draw cards using the ready action. It looks like they're not saying draw yet, and it might be another thing where it's a separate thing than drawing, like exhausted is a separate thing from discarding, but we'll see. Okay, that's probably why they're not using draw, because you choose a specific card. Which at this point, I don't really know that you need to have your cards arranged into a deck format, because a randomization element seems unnecessary. And in fairness, a deck would still be one of the more logical ways to place it, just because it keeps everything in the same place. But in theory, there's no reason if, and maybe there are other things that use randomization, but if you can choose which cards to draw, then you can really have them spread out and categorized however you want, and a deck is unnecessary. Okay, so cards played as an action are discarded, whereas ones used for energy are just exhausted. But unless there are a bunch more cards that use the energize mechanic than I've seen, having a full separate pile for exhausted cards seems unnecessary if it's going to be a relatively limited number of cards that even use the energize mechanic. card played with the exhaust keyword. Okay, so other cards are also exhausted. Well, now this is complicated because there's some potential for timer scamming here where you ready exhausted cards near the end of combat to make sure they don't go into your discard pile after combat. It looks like, exhausted is designed to be. It's like it's discarded, but it's only discarded at the end of combat. And also, you have to do specific things to reuse them. But you can ultimately take them back into your hand to unexhaust them without ultimately discarding them, it looks like, which is an interesting thing. So there are some equipment cards with unique actions that are not stored in your hand, and you can play them as if they were in your hand. And so they're not discarded or exhausted. Okay, I don't think there's a real need for them to not be in your hand. Like, you can choose to not place them in your hand if you want. Like, a lot of the organization stuff for this seems relatively pointless, It seems like there isn't a need for these to not be in your hands. There isn't a need for you to have a real deck. Some of these things seem more like suggestions than actual necessary rules. And since this isn't a fully traditional card game, I feel like there should be as little specifications for where to place each card in a play area as possible. Alright, I would not have these around till later. Like, if this is sort of an optional thing that might be helpful, you don't really want to put it in sort of the rule dump, because that has a chance of overwhelming people instead of, decreasing the amount of confusion, which is their purpose. Okay, deck, discard, exhausted cards. It's a reference. And then tokens. There's no space on the play area mentioned here for miscellaneous cards at present. And for that matter, where do you put persistent cards or cards that are currently being referenced for their ability? Like, what do you do with cards that you are playing or are in play? Putting them immediately in the discard is, not plausible for persistent cards, and is ultimately annoying for cards that you are currently using, even if they will eventually go into the discard when you're through with them. I'm going to go back to persistent cards to check for a second, just to make sure I'm not off base here. It should be in, like, card types or something. Okay, so they are placed in front of your character. Not even in the card play area, I guess. Okay, looks like you do an action for everything, pretty much. And you start with 3 action points. And advantage, disadvantage, that's always nice. But I'm not sure it's really nice with this system, because now you've got the modifier, the bonuses from potentially other from cards, and then advantage, disadvantage as well. Like when you're having multiple categories of things that are added and subtracted from the dice, having advantage and disadvantage on top of that for situational things as well sometimes gets overly complicated. I mean, it's not as bad in this because it looks like the number plus and minuses that are not modifiers are specifically from card effects and not situational factors in the story, and that there might be a delineation there between advantage and disadvantage, but okay, only 3 attributes. That's surprising. Okay, so used to resist negative effects or avoid dangerous situations. Is that more like a saving throw or more like you setting a number that the DM has to roll over? Okay. Mental and emotional fortitude, and basically knowledge varieties of checks versus physical stuff and health, so they seem to be relatively decently delineated at least. Okay, extra damage. Right, 2 damage for extra bleed. Alright. I'm probably not reading all of these. Let me see what this... Yeah. Card effect keyword, I'm definitely not reading all of these now, especially for the status effect stuff. And I'm not sure I agree with attributes being under card effect keywords for their first introduction. I'd also like more of a category for stuff like energize and all the other keywords that are not status effects to appear before the ones that are status effects, because I feel like there's a pretty huge difference in categorization, and one of them I might need to know from the beginning, whereas all the various status effects would be something I would want to look up, on the fly instead. Okay. Is difficulty value really a keyword on a card? Like, if I look here, will I see anything that says difficulty value in the keyword slot? Yeah, it doesn't seem like I am seeing that yet. So, again, I think the place this appears in is a little false. I don't think DV is really a card effect keyword. I think it's just a keyword. But I could be wrong. Like maybe DV is for if something, makes you do a save effectively. We'll see. Maybe. Okay, discard. Alright. So is there even a keyword for that if it's default? I don't really like this. Like, the main distinction between discard and exhausted is that one you can recover with an action and one you can't, and if it turns out you can recover discarded ones with an action, it's just slightly harder. That makes having the two distinct categories even more of a nuisance. Okay, that's very specific. Yeah, I'm gonna move on from this for a while. There's a lot of keywords here. You should not have this early in the rulebook, and these should be organized better so that a player can figure out what they need to look at for now and what only becomes important later. Here's the character sheet. I can see the attributes and skills, and it said you only, an attribute might be the wrong term here, but it said you added an attribute or a skill, but it looks like the skills might be derived from attributes, so that's kind of a misnomer then, a misphrased. I'm not reading the setting for now, just because the mechanics are very complicated and I want to make sure I can get a handle on those. It's giving that to, like, touchstones. This is coming on a little late, but I guess it's touchstones for the setting and not the mechanics, so not that late then. Never mind. Okay, class, origin, background, starting deck. Okay, so there is a deck creating step. It's not just decisions made here affect what your deck is. You also do create a deck with decisions separately, apparently. Destiny action. Okay, select a class. Okay. You gain 3 class starter cards. All of the class features. So we get features as well as cards. I would say if those features are not represented by cards, that is a huge mistake. Because, like, the whole point of the cards is to help you remember things to an extent. If, you also have to figure out the stuff that is not represented by cards, especially when there are passive cards in existence, that's a bad idea. I'm going to have to check that out immediately. Page 21. Classes. Okay, starting cards, starting skills. Which the skills are relatively fine because you can mark them on your character sheet. I guess the features you would too, but for something like a feature is something that would lend itself very well to a card. And is not something you have to write down, so there's no reason for it to be on the character sheet instead. Yeah, class features, class trait. So I still don't know what the features are yet. So that could just be the skills, in which case it's relatively fine for them to be on the character sheet alone, but I don't know if that's what they are. Okay, here are the features. And it's not saying anything about associated cards. Okay, when confronted with mechanical advice, contraption, making an intuition check. So would this be an action or not? Okay, and you get to choose class traits. But these, once again, don't appear to be represented by cards. I don't know yet. Because they might, like, when you get to the card building segment, or deck building segment, be like, and then add all your features or something, but then my only complaint would be that you should list that earlier and not that there are not codes for them at all. Okay. Okay, traits and skills. So another thing where we have separate lists of different things. that I'm not sure is yet necessary. Okay, are the starting skills just the skills, I guess? I might have misread that. Okay. Yeah, so those are the starting skills. So that makes more sense. You already start with 3 out of 6 there. That's kind of a lot. Not clear how skills work either, if it's like through proficiency or something else. I guess maybe you can buy points. Like, you can add multiple points to a skill and that changes the amount it modifies. Maybe that's how it works. Okay, more traits. Okay, at least you get a card for that. Okay, so if there are mechanics associated with background, it is not listed here, which is a problem. I can just scroll down to 61 to see if there are any mechanical elements. Okay, so you get features, but that's not listed. Where am I? I highlighted stuff, so yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't see anything about features here. Huh. Okay, starting deck. Here's where I find out if they don't have enough cards for things. You must choose 4 other cards from your class deck. And that's other in addition to these class starter cards, I think. But they need not be starter cards for that, maybe? Yeah, so it's just like 1 origin card, a couple class cards, nothing for all of the other details that your character gets that aren't numbers. They're full abilities, but they're not represented by cards. Okay, 8 cards in your deck. That's relatively small for a deck, isn't it? Okay, you can buy stuff. Choose your destiny, which I'm not really going to go over here. I think I'm going to have too much to, get a handle on already. Buy stuff, calculate a variety of things. Lots of calculations. Right now, I'm just going straight out to combat stuff so I can figure out how all this card stuff works even. I should have just gone back to the table of contents, really. Yeah, I'm gonna have to. Comma, that's 93. I'll go back to that map because that looked cool. It's a nice looking map. $93, that's what I was looking for, right? Yeah. Okay. So this is where it feels like I'm finally, like, figuring out what the rules actually are. Which I wouldn't normally complain about because character creation comes first generally, but I feel like I learned a lot about the cards except how they function at a basic level. Okay, square grid. All right. The start of each session or during a recover action, you choose which cards are in your hand and which are in your deck. Okay. That's interesting, you know, because recover I thought was the way you got back discarded cards. Does it do that too? Alright. Maximum hand size of 7, so all but one of their cards, really. Because you start with 8. But I can't guarantee that at this point. I haven't read enough, but it sounds like you would have a deck of 1 card, which is strange. Now that's maximum hand size, not starting hand size, right? Oh, okay, no, you will probably only have 1 card in your deck. So I am really not seeing the point of any of this really being card-based, because there's no element of drawing at random, there's no real differentiation between deck and hand. It really seems like just a system where various actions that all have cooldowns associated for the most part, and then there are rules for those cooldowns. So the card element is just more of a memory thing, really, but then not every ability or passive is represented by cards, which sort of invalidates that. I'm not sure it really takes advantage of the nature of cards in this system. If your character has 1 free hand, your hand size is increased by 1. That is way too minimal. Like, that adds significant complexity for minimal, change in gameplay, and doesn't fully make sense since it's not equipment specifically. So I wouldn't call it that a good idea. And also wouldn't I'm kind of confused because the items are represented by cards, and yet not having an item in your hand gives you more cards to freely use. That's counterintuitive. Okay, surprise, start with advantage or disadvantage, sure. Okay, there is a starting position specifically, it seems like. Now, 3 actions. Like, honestly, for a card-based system, I don't know that I would be that interested in also having, literal positioning be involved. I'd want a more limited range system if I was going to be using cards, but that's just me. Okay, don't know if there was movement splitting yet, technically. And that's a very important detail to have. Alright, so attribute modifier as well as 2d12, no mention of skills, so I'm going to guess that is less likely to be applied to cards. Yep, seen this a couple times. Okay, the second sentence explains this, but the first sentence is weird. Like, you couldn't play all your cards at once, all the ones in your hand, because you only have 3 actions, but they mean, like, you can go from move to card to move, and that second sentence explains that better. The fact that you intersperse actions in this way does imply that you can't split movement, but it's still not explicitly stated. So this is a little confusing because this is under standard actions, even though it's a subheading, that almost implies that energizing is an action, even though I don't think that's supposed to be the case. Okay, regain health. Like, I don't know why this says optionally exhausted play areas when I feel like, these are also optional for the recover action, though at least should be optional, or are you just saying you wouldn't necessarily have any exhausted there? I guess it's because you have to put your discards back into your deck if you recover, but you don't have to put your exhausteds back into your deck. But even then, I'm not sure why you would do it that way. So the optional part of that is weird, maybe. Okay. So, like, the main thing I needed to find out for this was, starting hand stuff. Because that is huge on how the entire flow of this is going to work as a card game. And though they don't mention starting hand specifically, it really seems like the stuff based on your hand size that maybe the deck and hand size limits that immediately your hand is at max and you pick your hand right. Yes, you choose which are in your hand. There's no random drawing, which really is a huge limitation on the point of even having cards, in my opinion. Like, it seems, to put it another way, it might be a little harder to do it, but this game probably could be played entirely without cards. Like, you would just have to write down your abilities and list when you've used them in what context. And since you're already writing down abilities without codes anyway, it kind of seems like, Right. Okay. Okay, 2 free actions. There's some free actions. Yeah, with the rest of the action that instigated it is fairly complicated, but, you can figure that out by feel, probably. Alright. So I feel like, I've got something of a handle on how this game works at a basic level at this point. Then again, I heard recover point mentioned before, and I do not see that here, which is very critical that recover point should be here if they're a thing that exists. Okay, recover. Yes, recovery point as detailed later, but not when the recovery action is actually, or the recover action is actually explained, or at least one of the times it's explained in the most, I would think, critical explanation. And it looks like recovery points have multiple uses. A lot of abilities involving recovery, but not a lot of mentions of... Yeah, there's no real mention, it looks like, of the full explanation of what the recover action is, and the fact that recovery points exist, which is very critical that those be together. Alright, so it looks like more or less the way the system works is you have a limited set of cards, you have a set of a bunch of other abilities that are not in cards. You immediately draw at will almost all of your deck. You play things and put them into 2 separate discard piles, depending on the situation, which can both be recovered from in slightly different ways. And whenever you're drawing, you always choose it. So, I think my main complaints about the system, it all seems interesting, it all seems functional. The abilities are probably cool. I don't really have a lot of time right now, so I can't look over what the classes actually are, which I'd like. This all seems functional, it's just I think it definitely does not lend itself well to easy learning at all, but that's something I expected from the beginning. I figured that was more a blurb than a real goal of the system, because card games, adding card game elements to a separate kind of game rarely actually simplifies things. But my 2 main complaints are, a lot of stuff, it seems like, could be streamlined and simplified, even if that's not one of the goals. There's a lot of minutia here. There is a separation between skills and abilities that are represented by points, that are represented by cards, and ones that are. And I get that part of that is because, even passive or persistent cards, you still have to use an action to play, whereas your other class abilities you don't at all. But I think for the sake of agreement, and for really determining the point of cards in this system, that every ability should be a card, and there should just be some that are always in play if they're, auto class stuff. And with that not being the case, it is fairly confusing why cards are involved at all if it's not roundly to represent abilities, because the randomization factor, the variance between a deck and a hand, and even to an extent a deck and a discard pile, since it's so easy to reuse resources in different ways, make it very hard to see what a real, what, like, this can either be an RPG card game fusion or an RPG that uses cards to represent certain things to make things easier. It appears to not really be easier. Not every ability is represented by a card, and the card game elements have very little to do with what I would consider the typical nature of a card game. I will say that having these be cooldowns without cards, like having you just, say, write a check mark next to an ability for if it is exhausted or quote-unquote discarded, even though it would not at that point be a card, and then, erasing that when you have performed the relevant action to reset it. Yeah, that is easier to do with cards, but they're not really necessary or core to the system in that context. Like, these days, I don't really have as much time for these reviews, so I can't look at what's actually good about this system, unfortunately. I can only just sort of see what jumps out to me as a flaw and talk about that. But hopefully some of this information will be beneficial to you, and it's all just my opinion. So, don't take it too hard. I mean absolutely no disrespect or anything like that.